Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this Illinois Newsroom Facebook page. I'm Reginald Hardwick, News and Public Affairs Director at Illinois Public Media and WILL. Over the next hour and a half, we are gathering together to have an honest discussion about police, policing, and public safety, and ask the question, what should be the role of police in Champaign-Urbana? These discussions are happening across America a lot this summer. Some say it was prompted by the recent police killings of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. Others will tell you the discussions and protests go back further to historic systems that used law enforcement to control communities of color. In a moment, we'll introduce our 8 panelists, and we encourage those of you on Facebook who are watching to submit questions that I can pass on to the panelists. We have a number of Illinois public media staffers monitoring our pages and sending me questions, and we already have a lot of questions already. So let's get started by introducing our panel, which includes community leaders, elected officials, law enforcement, scholars, and activists. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order. Community activist Titianna Ammons, her Facebook page shows participation in several Black Lives Matter protests this spring and summer. She is also a candidate for Champaign County Board District 11, which she is running unopposed. Champaign Police Chief Anthony Cobb. He is a Champaign native who became chief of his hometown in 2012. He also served as assistant chief in Urbana, where he served as the city's first community policing officer. Cobb is the second African-American police chief in Champaign. Deb Feinen is the mayor of Champaign. She was elected mayor in 2015 after being appointed to the city council in 2006 and then winning 2 terms as an at-large representative. She also served on the Champaign County Board, and she is also an attorney. Champaign County Sheriff Dustin Heuerman was sworn into office in 2018. He grew up in Effingham and was also a deputy in Douglas County before moving to Champaign County. Tariq Khan is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His research deals with settler colonialism, state violence, social movements, and political repression in US history. Diane Marlin has served as the mayor of Urbana since 2017. A native of LaSalle County, she has lived in Urbana since 1971. She was first elected to the city council in 2009, and she retired after faculty roles at both Parkland College and U of I. Naomi Paik is an associate professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her latest book examines the criminalization of foreign-born people in the US. She is also co-author of the article Worlds Without Police in the Radical History Review. Evelyn Reynolds is associate professor of sociology at Parkland Community College. She is a graduate of Illinois State University and the founder of the Black Lives Matter Champaign-Urbana chapter. And I want to welcome all of you and thank you for taking time out of your evening to join us tonight. And as our audience can see at home, we are doing a virtual town hall to practice social distancing in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so for that reason, I want to remind our panelists to raise their hands or hit the hand button on your Zoom call if you want to make a point and not jump in so that we don't overtalk each other and cancel each other out on our mics. And again, if you are watching us on Facebook and you want to comment, feel free to share comments or if you have a question for the panelists. And also you can text us, you can join our text club. Go to text safety to 217-803-0730, 217-803-0730. You can join our text club and you can also text us a question. So let's get started. First, I want to start with a 10 to 20 second answer from all of you about why you agreed to and accepted our invitation to be here tonight and talk with us. And I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order and start with Professor Evelyn Reynolds.
Good evening, everybody. I am here and I accepted this invitation because I am a person that does advocate for the abolition of the police system, as well as other things, other repressive systems. And there's a lot of conversation around that right now. And so I wanted to be a part of a dialogue that helps to explain what that means, and also kind of debunk perhaps some of the myths around policing and the use and value of police as they exist today.
Okay. Professor Paik.
Hi, thanks for having me. Similar to Dr. Reynolds, I wanted to accept this invitation because I wanted to raise why defunding, dismantling, and disempowering the police would actually promote our collective community safety and our well-being overall. I also wanted to talk about how our decades-long overinvestment in policing and other forms of state violence reflect our moral and social values, and that reallocating resources away from police into other kinds of resources like quality food, housing, healthcare, and so on would actually reflect our actual values. And so I think that taking away resources from police and putting them into the resources where everyone can have what they need to live well and thrive is the better way to obtain the community safety that we all want.
Mayor Marlin.
Well, we're at a crossroads in history in many ways. We're navigating a pandemic, but we're also now examining very closely what public safety, what community safety, and what a healthy community looks to people, and what the role of the police can be and should be in that community. So this is a very important conversation, and we're going to be focusing on this for considerable time to come. So it was very important to be part of the conversation.
And Tariq Khan.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm interested in this question on a personal level, but also as a historian and somebody who does research on sort of the roots of policing in the United States. And as we ask this question of, what should be the role of police, that's very much a philosophical question. But there's this other question that we need to begin with, which is, why do we have police in the first place? And that's a historical question for which there is a right answer. And so my reason for being here is I wanted to, I have a thing or two to say about what is the historical roots of policing in the United States.
Sheriff Heuerman.
Good evening, Reginald and everybody. So I accepted the invitation because as the elected sheriff, I serve all 200,000 plus residents of Champaign County. And I want to be part of the conversation. I want to make sure that I am serving the residents of Champaign County to the best of my abilities. And that includes listening to what the residents of Champaign County want, all of the residents of Champaign County. In my professional opinion, the police are needed in many situations, and they're also overutilized in a lot of situations as well. And there's a lot of room to put some of those roles onto social service agencies, and I'm very interested in how we can help make that happen.
Mayor Feinen.
I accepted the invitation as part of my journey and learning about these issues. My belief system with respect to policing and many issues have been challenged, particularly in this last year. And I think it's important that our leaders are willing to listen and learn. And I see that as part of my role tonight, is to have the opportunity to hear the opinions of different people from the community.
Chief Cobb.
Thank you. I'm here tonight to listen, to learn, to hear input and different perspective. I accepted the role because I think it's important for me as the chief of the city of Champaign to be open to all dialogue, to hear what our citizens have to say, and to be able to provide accurate information about the Champaign Police Department and what we're providing, the service we're providing. I agree with Sheriff Heuerman as he states about there are a lot of things that we do well. There's room for improvement, and there's a lot of things we may not should be doing in the future, but we want to talk to our public about that.
And Titianna Ammons.
Sorry, just noticed I was muted. I accepted the invitation mainly because I'm a voice of the young people. I'm a young person and I'm growing in my activism. So often we hear everybody say, we want to hear what the community has to say, yet even once they have heard it, they ignore what that is. I took this invitation as well because I wanted to understand what is the percentage gap that we see when it comes to 30 to 50% of Black people being incarcerated or jailed versus the population only being 12 to 15%. So I wanted to make sure that I was here at this table to find out some of those answers along with the community.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. Those very quick and brief answers. And we want to start by looking at the past. We want to start throughout this whole conversation looking at the past, the present, and the future. And we're going to start by talking about the history of law enforcement in America, which may give us some perspective of how we arrived in this moment in our country. NPR's History podcast team put together this short video last week. Take a look.
Policing in America started in the mid-1600s with the Boston Watch, essentially a neighborhood watch group. But some of the first police forces in the South were created to control enslaved Black people. They would come to be known as slave patrols. Almost all white men had to serve in these patrols.
Their duties were written into law, like this slave patrol statute from Louisiana in 1835.
Arrest any slave or slaves, whether with or without a permit, who may be caught in the woods or forest with any fire or torch, which slave or slaves thus arrested shall be subjected to corporal punishment not exceeding 30 stripes. And so the tying together early on, the surveillance, the deputization essentially of all white men to be police officers, and then to dispense corporal punishment on the scene are all baked in from the very beginning.
The Civil War eventually brought an end to slavery in America. But for most Black people in the South, it didn't fundamentally change their lives.
And by the early 20th century, the KKK would emerge to enforce control over Black citizens in the South. And this pushed millions of Black citizens to flee to northern, progressive cities as part of what would become known as the Great Migration.
Police officers receive African American migrants in the same way that their white neighbors and community peers did, which is with contempt and hostility. When a white person throws a Molotov cocktail into a new Black homeowner on a street that had previously been all Irish or all Polish or all German, the police come and they arrest the Black family and defend the white mob. And this happens time and time, over and over again. They are policing the racial norms of white supremacy from the very beginning in the North.
Black skin becomes equated with criminality.
And according to Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the system hasn't fundamentally changed since then. He says that pointing out the problem is clearly not sufficient to fix the system.
Because the problem has been known for a century. The evidence has been presented for a century. The recommendations for change, for holding police officers accountable, for charging them with criminal offenses when they behave criminally. It's a century of the same story playing out over and over again. It seems to me that's what's possible is recognizing that police officers and police agencies are incapable of fixing themselves. And so the question that has to be asked in the wake of George Floyd, and I think this question is being asked and answered by more white people than I've seen in my lifetime, is, do white people in America still want the police to protect their interests over the rights and dignity and lives of Black and, in too many cases, brown, indigenous, and Asian populations in this country?
Our whole country is waiting to hear the answer to that question.
See, even the professionals sometimes mumble there. I want to ask Champaign Mayor Deb Feinen, do you believe policing in the past has been used by the people in power, mostly white people, mostly white residents, to control communities of color?
It's clear that it has. I think we still see some evidence of that even today. I mean, we have citizens that utilize police calls. I mean, we just saw the woman, I believe in New York, who made the call. And you have people who, if you look at things like Nextdoor or other social media sites, who are, concerned about an African American youth in their neighborhood who's doing nothing more than, walking down the sidewalk, but suddenly the neighborhood's on alert and everybody wants to call 911. So part of what we need to do here is not just be talking about police, but we need to be talking about retraining our citizens about what is really a necessary police call.
Sheriff Heuerman, let me ask you, you have a bachelor's and master's degrees in criminology. After that video, is that the history that is taught in training? And do you think that creates a bias for white law enforcement officers that are maybe unfamiliar with people of color? Maybe they didn't grow up with them, or maybe they learn what they knew about them from the media, and then once they go out into the force, are interacting. How does what we saw in the history of law enforcement affect communities of color?
Well, so my personal perspective, I grew up in Effingham, which is a primarily white community, at least whenever I was growing up. And I will tell you that I have had to work really hard to overcome some of the things that I learned growing up. And I think sometimes I consciously think, why am I thinking what I'm thinking? And not just with African Americans, or not just race or religion or anything like that. It's kind of foreign to me, right? It was before I moved to the Champaign-Urbana area. And that's one thing that I think a lot of times we see is if you don't grow up in an area that is diverse, then it's very difficult to understand. It's very difficult to respect that diversity. I've come a long way in 10 years being up in this area than I would have been at 15 years old. Looking at that video, it's sickening. I would like to think that my deputies are enforcing the laws for the right reasons. There's no doubt that there are unethical officers out there, and as hard as we try, sometimes they get through the cracks. And then once they do, it's relatively difficult for us to get them then off of the police force if we even do know about it. But I also think that what I have seen over the last couple of months is the association that all police officers who happen to be white are racist or biased. And I don't believe that's true. And so, trying to let the community know that we're here, we are not going to hurt you if you come in contact with us. But every time we try to do that, it seems like there's a poor example set in the community, and trying to figure out how in the world do we get rid of these bad police officers and then finally gain the trust of the community again is really what I think part of the struggle is.
Chief Cobb, let me ask you, the video that we watched, is that a model of police history that's familiar to you? And do recruits learn, that as well before they hit the streets?
Yes, that is a model of police history that I have learned. Did I learn it at the academy? No. Do they teach it at the academy? In all honesty, I don't think so. I can't say for certain. I went to the academy in the 90s. There's so many things that you have to learn going through the academy. But the history of policing was not something that was instructed to me there. I do think it's important for officers to learn the history of policing and know how our profession came about, know about some of the things that our profession may have done and how our profession may have oppressed or helped race us down. I do think that's important. I know when I've taught classes, we've talked about the history. I spoke with officers about the history of policing. It's good to know that and know how we evolved and where we're at today. When I think about Jim Crow laws, when I think about separate but not equal, when I think about even some things that came out of slavery and the role of police during those time periods, it's something that's resonate because we have citizens who remember or who were born during those time eras that are still with us, whether it be Jim Crow, whether it be separate but not equal. Those things are prevalent in their head, and that may be their only contact with law enforcement.
Evelyn Reynolds, you're a sociology professor at Parkland Community College. how do you change policing or look at the issue of racial bias in policing? Do you believe that the police are the problem, or it's a symptom of larger racial issues in America? Let me ask that first.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the video was spot on as far as the history of policing, and that's also the present state of policing, in my opinion. And I think we see that locally and we see that nationally as well. Tatiana brought up a really good point at the beginning of this segment with the question of why are so many Black folks in this community, in this county, incarcerated at such a disproportionate rate. And I think the same question can be asked on a national level because the same is true. More Black and brown folks are incarcerated more than any other ethnic category of people, and Indigenous folks as well. So this has always been the role and the practice of policing in this country, historically and today. And so I think that, regarding the few bad apples perception is not, really accurate, because if you're a part of this system that operates in this specific function, in which it clearly does, then you are a part of the overall oppression of Black and brown bodies, and of the oppression of disabled bodies and non-gender conforming folks. You are a part of that system because you adhere and you're employed and you're invested in that particular system. And so, I think that when it comes to change and abolition and transformation, we certainly have to start with police units in particular, because they are kind of the key purveyors of this sort of violence and social repression, aside from the military. But on a local level, it's law enforcement.
Tariq Khan, how do you change a system that literally goes back to America's founding?
Right. Yeah. How to change the system? That's a massive question. But we definitely have to start by recognizing what that system even is. I don't think that as a society, we are even recognizing the anti-Black and the anti-Indigenous roots of the United States. We tell ourselves a lot of myths about what the United States is. And so we've lied to ourselves as a society. And so we have to get rid of that sort of shared delusion to begin with, and recognize that what the United States is and how it is built on genocide of Indigenous peoples and control of Black people. And we can't really exaggerate how foundational settler colonialism and enslavement are to what the United States is and continues to be. And so we see, even in the present, that the people who are most likely to be killed by police are Indigenous people. Second most likely are Black people. Same thing in terms of incarceration, it's Indigenous people and Black people, and that cuts back to those roots. And so we need to start with an honest assessment of what the United States is and stop telling ourselves these patriotic lies.
Professor Paik, you're an associate professor of Asian American Studies at University of U of I. And I read an article, you talked about countries in history that operated either without police forces or a very different picture than what we have in the US now. Since we're talking a little bit about history, and we'll get back into the present in a little bit, what do those law enforcement or systems look like?
Well, I think the main point to get out of some of those articles is that I think when we talk about a world without police, or the abolition of police, or the dismantling of police, it sounds like crazy fiction, like something way out into the future, or something that's just not possible. Even some of the retorts are just like, well, we still need police, right? But I think if we look at historical examples, and some of them are not that long ago, we can see that that it is possible to create spaces where police are not really there, and yet you don't see just chaos and just like rampant interpersonal violence and things like this. So in the article that you mentioned, I referred to, maroon communities in Brazil. of Black and Indigenous people who created their own kind of communities away from state violence, right? And it doesn't mean that they didn't have interpersonal conflict or anything like that, but they didn't involve any kind of state-based purveyors of violence, right? To control those interpersonal conflicts. I think you can see other kinds of examples like in colonial Northern India, that colonial Northern Indians actually opposed the British colonial police and created their own systems, relied on their own systems to deal with conflict over like cattle thieving and things like this. And so they relied on different kinds of culturally competent or like culturally informed ways of dealing with conflict. And I think that what it shows is that we don't actually need police, and that we have been fed a kind of history and a kind of understanding of what our social order needs, and that it absolutely depends on police. And I think that this is an untrue story, right? And I think looking at these historical examples gives us some tools and gives us some models to work with.
Tatiana, we have many citizens and even the president who says they are law and order. And in this historical context of policing communities, what does this mean to you? What does this history mean to you?
Well, as we talk about disempowering, dismantling, and rebuilding what policing can look like, and we talk about on a structural level, listening to the sheriff when he said, we don't learn about these things, right? So if we're saying that we are starting with a conversation in the way that Black people have to have conversations with their children on how to interact and talk and address the police, why is it not in the reverse when it comes to the officers, when they're hiring them? What is happening in their classroom or spaces that says, this is how you interact with community, this is how you interact with Black people, so that they also understand when they come into the communities that they typically do not live in. And I think that, more officers should live in the communities that they're serving. But because they do not, that needs to be implemented so that we do not continue to have that power struggle that we've seen historically and that we're still seeing currently.
Okay. And Mayor Marlin, I'll, before we move on to kind of more present concerns, how do you talk to more powerful people, the majority of white people who have been, in power, in a lot of our cities and our towns and going back and back, and explain to them this history? I mean, do you think they're aware of it? And how do you get that knowledge to those communities who, may not even be aware of how communities of color have been literally policed? Oops. Or unmute yourself.
I should know by now, right? I grew up in a small community, rural community, a couple hours north of here, mostly white community. And of course, we never had this history lesson in school. And I have been doing a lot of reflection over the past few months. And one of the truths is that, I grew up feeling that if I needed help, I could call the police, and I trusted the police, and I trusted that they would help me. And it wasn't until I came to Urbana-Champaign and lived here for a while and started learning from people and realized that for people of color, it was the opposite. For many people, that was not how they grew up. That was not what they grew up believing or even in their experience. And that was an eye-opening, that was a revelation to me, because you grow up one way and then you realize someone else has a completely different experience and perspective, and that's one of the things we have to address today. But I tell you, over the last few weeks, I've been meeting individually with some of the officers in Urbana, and doing more listening than talking, and just trying to understand their perspective. And for people, especially who've grown up in Urbana, the attitude is, they went into the police service to serve, and I think any conversation we have moving forward needs to include the officers that we have today so we can learn from them and make sure that they are aligned with community values of treating each other with respect and basically respect is the bottom line.
We've been texted a question from Logan Middleton, and apparently we're getting a few people who have asked this question. What is the difference between police and policing? Does anyone want to take that answer? Go ahead, Professor Paik.
So first of all, thank you to the people who have asked that question. So I think as we're thinking, the movement to defund the police is often targeted at specific police departments, like the Minneapolis Police Department, et cetera. But I think we also need to think about policing as a kind of it's a different modality of power that lots of us and lots of different kinds of people can participate in. So for example, I was listening to one of our students talk about the movement to divest the university from police. And she was talking about how it's not just the cops that racially profile her and her friends, but it's also like apartment managers, right? Or housing units and things like this that also kind of, look at her and her Black and brown friends a little bit differently and like ask for their identification in ways that they don't ask of her white friends and things like this. So these kind of powers can be enacted not just by uniformed police. We even see that in vigilante violence, like around Ahmaud Arbery or George Zimmerman, right? We see like these powers kind of taken over about disciplining and controlling, right? But the thing is that policing and the formal police, what their role historically and presently has been about is about maintaining a social order. And in the United States, as Tariq rightly pointed out, in the United States, our social order is built fundamentally on unequal social relations. It was built on like one of the most inegalitarian societies you could imagine, right? Covered over by this kind of ideal vision of itself that it was all about egalitarianism, right? But you have the role of the police is to maintain that unequal social order. And it's not just the police who maintain it, right? And so what I want to see as we move to defund the police, I don't want to see those powers redistributed into, for example, private security companies or surveillance companies, or in, asking our teachers to act more like cops than teachers, et cetera. So I think we need to think about the formalized uniform police, but we also need to think about policing as a way that we relate to each other, and we need to fundamentally change how we relate to each other.
Chief Cobb or Sheriff Heuerman, one of you answer, what is the difference between police and policing in your view, the law enforcement view?
Yeah, sure, I can. I think that was a very good explanation, actually, that was just given. And whenever you asked the question, I was wondering, I've never really thought necessarily about that. But I would see the police as those who do the policing, and the policing is more of the strategies. So how do we, unfortunately, we have some discretion as police officers, but a lot of the laws that are in place need to be changed in order for policing strategies to be changed. I think that policing strategies or policing is how we go about maintaining that social order, whereas the police are the right people to do it. And what I mean by that is, since I've been sheriff, I am not looking for a lack of a better term, G.I. Joe, right? I am not looking for that model police officer. I am looking for somebody who is passionate. I am looking for somebody who wants to come and make a difference. And I am looking for somebody who truly cares about the community as much as I can tell. To me, that is what the police should be, going when somebody needs help and trying to help them to the best of their abilities. Now, I believe there are some policing strategies that have been used in the past that have been biased and discriminatory. So that's kind of how I would differentiate between the two of those there.
Okay. If you're just joining us, my name is Reginald Hardwick. I'm with Illinois Public Media, and this is a Facebook Live virtual town hall on the Illinois Newsroom Facebook page. We're asking what should be the role of policing in Champaign-Urbana. And again, we know lots of you are sending in lots of questions. You can also text us, and that number is, you can text SAFETY to 217-803-0730 to join our text club, and then text your questions. We've touched a little bit about history. I want to talk about the shift to the present, and we certainly have a lot of questions that I may take from our viewers and our listeners. I want to talk to you, Anthony Cobb. You are the police chief of Champaign. You are also a Black man. And I want to know, when you're not in uniform and not in this immediate area, do you have concerns about interactions with law enforcement?
No, when I'm not in uniform, when I'm not in this area, I'm a citizen and I strive to be a citizen. I don't worry about law enforcement. I don't put myself in places or do things that where I'll come in contact with law enforcement for the most part. Most of the time when I'm on vacation, I'm with family, I'm with friends, I'm relaxing and enjoying myself. So no, I'm not overly concerned or thinking something bad's gonna happen to me. Yes, I've been stopped by the police when I've been off duty. My encounters have always been positive. I've never shared that I am a police officer. I was fortunate in the context that I've had. I've run across excellent police officers. With any profession, I think there's great people out there. There's average people, and there's some that probably can do it better. I've been fortunate to run into the good.
Evelyn, let me ask you and follow up to that. I mean, what are you hearing from young men, young women who are Black and brown, you know, their concerns about policing and police officers? So let's just say that, law enforcement.
Yeah. Well, I think there's always exceptions to the rule, right? We're talking a lot of generalizations. Not everything impacts everyone, but there's certainly a lot of generalizations and connections and patterns that we can note. And so I think for a lot of Black folks, I'll just speak from that perspective, since that's the way that I identify, there is a fear of police. There is a distrust of police. And many folks like myself do not see police as an option as far as if an emergency or crisis ensues. That's not, our go-to, call for help. And so I think that we also have to kind of consider our personal positions as well, as far as our social class positions, our gender, conforming or non-conforming positions, our positions as far as ability and lots of other aspects of privilege, because that has a role in that, right? And so the way that my encounters with police, and I've had some in this town, have also been shaped by the fact that I am, I've been kind of vocal and in the public, and, there's some folks that know that I, teach at a college. And so I think in some ways I've been safeguarded from some of the more harmful aspects of police violence that other younger, folks and folks not connected to these institutions or who don't have these labels are subject to. And I certainly hear from a lot of my students, Black students, Latinx students, Indigenous students, who are often, saying that they distrust police, or talking about what happened over the weekend, being pulled over, police storming in a party with guns, and all those sorts of things are frequent conversations. And so I think that note of position, that personal position, the privileges or lack of privileges that we have, really does sometimes shape and mediate the relationship that we have to police. And I wanted to note, to conclude, I'm also hearing from the sheriff and even from the mayor or two, this sort of option of learning about diverse populations, and this option of learning about, the history of policing and that sort of thing. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that also notes the privilege that these individuals inhabit. It's not an option for Black people to learn about police and the ways that white supremacy affects our daily lives. We're born and thrown right into this system, and we have to deal with it every single day. It's not an option for us. And so that's another area of privilege that I've noted even in this conversation.
Mayor Feinen, I see you shaking your head in agreement.
I totally agree. I mean, similar to your question for Mayor Marlin, I mean, I grew up in Champaign, and there were many things that were not taught in our history classes And then I, went to college and law school and, learned probably more about civil rights and the kinds of things we're talking about today in law school, but not as much in college. I mean, I just think that there is an incredible amount of privilege. There is, we have to change the way we're educating our kids. Police is part of the problem, but it is certainly not the whole problem that needs to be addressed.
Well, last week, Champaign's police department released an updated use of force policies to the Champaign City Council, including de-escalation, warning before shooting, officers intervening during unlawful use of force, and a ban on chokeholds. But the department also said those were already standard practices for decades. So in this moment, Chief Cobb, is there anything new that the city of Champaign and your force can ensure for safety between the police force and communities of color? Is there anything new that's being brought forward in ordinances? We're getting a lot of questions about that.
As you spoke about the new policy that we put in effect around use of force, we also shared during that same meeting that we're looking to engage in town home discussions with our community, having small group conversations, Zoom, as well as some in-person meetings. We're looking to talk with our residents about what are our policing strategies and our policing practices within our community, and to hear and learn from that. From those discussions, we're looking at what type of recommendation, what type of changes are we looking to bring forward to our city council to look to see what we're going to enact. So there's a lot of things that are going to be happening over the next several weeks, several months, as we engage in conversation with our community about the quality of service when it comes to police service that has been provided in our community. And our approach is going to be open, transparent, and let's talk with our citizens to hear and learn, make sure we report back accurately, and then we can act and do the things that we need to do in order to make sure we're providing the appropriate service that our citizens are asking for.
And let me follow up with that, either Chief Cobb or Mayor Feinen. I mean, to have communities talking but they've been, in some cases, talking for a long time. How do we turn into those words and those things that have been said or that people are discussing? How does that turn into action, and how does that turn into policy change? And can it lead to policy change?
I think it has led to policy change in the past. I think that, the chief can speak to the changes that have already been made in Champaign police policy, some of them in response to recent issues, but many of them over the course of the time that he has been chief, as he's looked at what was going on within our policies and within our community. I think we have a council that is incredibly engaged and listening to the community. I don't have the same experiences as African-American citizens, but what I can do is listen to them and hear their experiences and work with council to enact policy changes that reflects their needs.
Tatianna, let me turn to you. Okay, Tatianna, let me turn to you. I mean, when you talk to the community and you're at these protests and they're saying, possibility of and these ordinances are going through. I mean, what is the community? What's the reaction?
The reaction is that there has been so many conversations with no actions. We have, as a community, not just locally, but nationally, have asked for union protections to be taken away. We know that radical change is going to have to happen in order to really get the policing culture, I guess, to really change and move in a different direction. We keep going in the same circle, talking about, oh, we're going to use body cams. We know that did not work. So we want, officers removed from the force when they are in altercations that they use excessive force or have killed someone. Yet that is not what normally happens. we have leaders in place and, you know, the chief sitting in these meetings. And so why not take the major step forward? And when you're no longer in your uniform, be that community citizen along with us, because we have already given our demands. We have already cried out so many times, showing up to county board meetings and city councils just to ultimately get the same thing. We're hearing the same answers over and over, which is telling us that the people who are representing us are not representing us, they're representing them and those who look like them. That's what we see over and over again on policy, locally, nationally, with the police. So when I'm at the protests, we're to a place where we're saying, what kind of action do we have to take to make them change? Is it voting? Is it voting? Let's all gather at the voting places. Let's, vote by mail is going to be new this time around. We have the census. Let's really use our voices collectively to get the change that we want, because having these conversations are getting us nowhere.
I have a question that's being posed to the two mayors, Mayor Marlin and Mayor Feinen. What ordinance changes are being proposed that will require changes to the Fraternal Order of Police contract to enable review boards of both cities to make binding recommendations about discipline, including termination, that cannot be overturned by outside arbitration?
Well, I'll take a shot at that first. One thing to remember about ordinances, when an ordinance is brought to council, it is the result of sometimes months and months of work behind the scenes. So that is the end result. So at this point in time, there currently is not an ordinance, focused on that particular effect. I will say that our contract with the FOP is renewed every 3 years. We are about to enter negotiations. We haven't yet laid out the parameters, but I know this is a topic that may come up. With regard to civilian oversight, we're currently in the process of retooling our Civilian Police Review Board. We were one of the first in the area to actually establish one, and I think it was about 12 years ago. It needs updating, retooling. We're changing some of the processes involved. We may be looking at the basic policy, the ordinance itself, but there certainly is a demand and a need for more direct civilian oversight and accountability. We're also going to be reviewing our use of force policy. Champaign will follow Champaign's lead in that they have a civilian or a citizen actually participating in the internal use of force committee, which I think is a good idea, and Chief Seraphin and I intend to make that change as well. So we are making changes now, but as far as an ordinance specifically that you mentioned, it's not there yet.
Mayor Feinen?
We do have a citizen review board and a use of force committee that serves with the chief. The chief has already changed several policies. We talked about that at our last meeting with the police. And as the chief has said, we are now going out to the community to talk with them. We will have additional study sessions then to discuss what changes will be coming. We have committed to the 8 can't wait. And we have also signed on to the NAACP proposals relating to policing. So we continue to work on these issues. One thing I think it is worth raising, though, that some of the issues are state statute issues relating to the police, and whether or not we make changes to our contract. I think everyone is aware of the officer that the city of Champaign had many years ago, probably 5 years ago now, that chief recommended that we terminate. Our city manager upheld the termination, and arbitration put him back on our force. And so, when you look at these issues, you also need to be looking at the state level and looking at what changes may be necessary there.
I have a question for the sheriff and the chief. What specific steps must an officer take before using deadly force? And are there any changes being proposed to clarify the ambiguities in use of force policies?
When it comes to use of deadly force, basically the state statute requires the officer to feel that there's a threat to him or someone else where it's going to cause great bodily harm or death. In those circumstances, that's where an officer could potentially use deadly force. The circumstance is always going to dictate how the officer responds and address it. There can be times someone may be in a position where they might can cause great bodily harm or death to me, but I'm able to get cover or something along those lines, and officers able to talk or de-escalate the situation. So state statutes determine when deadly force can be used, and that is the requirement.
Sheriff Heuerman?
No, I would agree that state statute does dictate when use of deadly force can be used. It's a little more subjective whenever there are multiple situations where different levels of force may be used. And we try to de-escalate the situation if at all possible beforehand. And that is a mind frame of what was the officer thinking at the time where he was in the situation in which he was in, which is always kind of different when you're looking back into what happened as opposed to what was that officer going through at the time where the decision was made. So that's the only thing I think I would add to Chief Cobb's comment.
Let me follow up with both of you and asking, how do you hold officers accountable who don't follow the policies, and maybe you take action, both managers of forces, but still somehow they are able, because of their maybe union representation or other policies, still allowed to come back? I mean, how do you hold officers accountable? I think there are a lot of communities that are asking that.
As far as us, it depends on what the infraction is, but we have policies and procedures. We have union contracts, and as far as how we have to administer discipline, but we will follow our procedures in doing so. First level of discipline is Gene and it depends on what it is. There's something that doesn't start at the low level, so the infraction is going to weigh in there, but we're talking minor offenses. It could be verbal counseling, working our way up to written reprimands, to days suspension, days off. Major infraction is going to be into days off or even possibly termination. The officer in which the mayor spoke about earlier that we dealt with, the one I recommend termination for, and that arbitrator sitting back to us to work. When he got back there, when he came in, first stop was chief's office. And the conversation I had with that employee is, new slate. The arbitrator said, you're coming back, you're here. But policies haven't changed. Standards haven't changed, nor has the expectations changed. And if you do the same things that you did when I fired you the first time, I'll fire you again. But at the same token, I have to get an officer a chance to do his job and move forward, policing and providing service to our citizens as we would expect. And then we'll monitor it closely as we possibly can and address any behaviors that come up if they arise once the officer returns.
Sheriff Heuerman.
Well, I don't have as much experience as Chief Cobb, and and so I would say that I haven't dealt with any major use of force issues, complaints, anything like that. But one thing that I have done with some situations is I make sure that, number one, my expectations are set, that violations of the policy, I expect officers to be ethical, even if that's not necessarily specifically covered in policy. I expect them to treat everybody like human beings. And I make that very well known. It doesn't matter the color of your skin, your religion, your sexual orientation, etc. And the other thing is I try really hard to be consistent. And so I don't want to leave any room for officers to have the perception that because they may think I like them a little bit more than another officer, that I'm going to be easier on them. I try really hard not to give that perception to anybody and hold everybody accountable. Hopefully, if I hold them accountable at those earlier stages, then it won't advance to anything more. So that's my limited experience in the last year and a half.
And I want to remind people in our Facebook chat, we are putting links into some of the comments that people are saying. For example, some of the different policies and ordinances in Champaign and Urbana. Tariq, I want to ask you, historically, when you look at these ordinances and things that have come through the years, especially in the last, half century or so, what is the context that you can put onto this? Obviously we've seen changing. I remember a time there wasn't community policing, there is now community policing, but, overall, has it made a difference? Has it made a change? What is your perspective?
That's a great question. First of all, we need to recognize that these kinds of changes never come about until after there's major uprising of people. And so when these changes do come about, more often than not, they're not changing anything about the function of policing. What they're doing is sort of trying to pacify those uprisings. And then we get civilian review boards, we get, some new policy here or there, and yet the violence continues. We get, okay, let's hire a, more racially diverse police force. Doesn't change anything about the violence, because racially diversifying the police force did not change the function of policing. And so what I'm hearing from Dr. Paik and Dr. Reynolds and Titianna is they're saying these issues are structural, systemic, and this isn't about bias, right? If this was as simple as bias, this would have been solved decades ago. But the problem isn't bias. Yeah, sure, there's a few police officers here and there, Mad Dog Matt Rush, who's worse than the average police officer. But even the good police officers will still simply by doing their job will still uphold this system, because there's a certain function that they serve in society, and that's a violent function. And so I don't really have any faith in these kinds of reforms. We saw Urbana just did a thing where we're defunding there was a lot of public outcry to defund the police. And so what did Urbana do? They said, okay, we're going to cut this much, 150,000, I forget the exact number, from the police budget. Well, what was cut? All it meant was, instead of getting the new car this year, we'll drive the old car for the rest of the year and get the new car next year. And instead of 2 new police officers, we'll have 1 new police officer. And they spun that as feminist, because, it's a woman police officer. It's a feminist thing, right? Did anything change in terms of the power of the police? The power the police have, the deadly, murderous power that the police have over people in the community? No. Did anything in the function of the police change? No. And so we're seeing these problems are systemic. They're deeply historically rooted. This requires deep systemic change. And if we just keep hacking at the branches, a little bias training and things like this, it might be useful to help pacify an uprising temporarily, but the police are going to keep on killing people and incarcerating people, and these problems will continue.
Do we have any response to that from either our leaders or law enforcement? Is this a pacification just to do these ordinances, or is real change possible?
I think real change is possible, except it's not going to happen in 2 months. We have to make it a thoughtful process. We have to make sure we have a plan in place that's sustainable and that we have the resources to sustain it. So the budget trimming that was done last month at the Urbana City Council, it was cutting a little bit off the budget, but if you're going to talk about real meaningful change, it's going to take a very thoughtful, planful process. I personally feel an area that is a good place to start is our response to our police response to mental health emergencies. So many of our police calls are calls for service for folks who are it's a mental health related response. And We are working on a plan for an alternative emergency response for that. But it's something that us cities cannot do alone. Here, especially here in Champaign-Urbana, we have Urbana, the University, Champaign, we have county, and we're going to need to work as a region for making some of these systemic changes as well, particularly when you think about the mental health emergencies, housing situations, and things like that. So I really don't want people to think that, you know, you're going to see systemic change happen in the next few months. It's going to take time for us to figure out a path forward. And that's what I would like to learn, is how do you get from where we are today to where you see us and where you want us to be in the future. I haven't seen yet a kind of a blueprint for that. So that's what I would like to really learn at this point.
Yeah, and I would echo what Mayor Marlin said. I think about when I started my tenure as chief in the city of Champaign and arriving at the Champaign Police Department, and some of the issues that we were facing, things we had to deal with. There were a lot of citizens who were upset, who were spending a lot of time in our council chambers, a lot of time venting their frustration and anger with my agency. But we rolled our sleeves up. We worked with our citizens. We worked with our elected officials. And we really made some impactful changes over time. We're not perfect, but we slowly, I believe, gained the trust of our public. I don't have people coming ready to tear our doors down like they were when I first got there. We don't have our council chambers packed with people upset or venting frustration, but they want change. They want to see improvement from us, and we're always striving to do that. I think we have a great group of officers who are open and willing to serve. They're willing to listen to our public and treat everyone with unconditional respect. When it comes to the police service that we're providing, I think Mayor Marlin hit the nail on the head when you talk about there's a lot of things that law enforcement that's involved in are things that we should think about, should they be involved in? When budgets get tight, things change, services reduce, everyone push that over to police to deal with, whether it be mental health issues, closing of state institutions, or whether it be we get calls, a kid won't go to school, so they want the police to come. A parent want the police to come and get their kid in the car and take them to school. We get all type of calls that we're saying, why are the police even being sent to it? Those things happen on a regular basis. Those are the type of things we need to look at, talk about, and use the police in the roles in which they need to be dealt with. We have some significant gun violence in our community right now. I think law enforcement should be responding and addressing that to deal with those issues to keep our community safe. We have other issues that may be of major concern, whether it be a traffic issue, where there's a safety issue, where we can protect citizens from getting hit by cars, or protect citizens from having run-ins where it can be avoided or preventable through traffic or direction through traffic enforcement. Those are things law enforcement can take on from the proactive standpoint. I do think we need to spend more time building relationships with our citizens. I think that's first and foremost. We need to get our officers freed up out of the cars, spending time building relationships with citizens before someone calls 911. But most of the time, officers are going call to call, dealing with 911 issues, and we don't get to do those things that are important that our citizens desire and have repeatedly asked for.
I'm going to ask the panel a question that we're getting a lot of also from listeners and watchers and viewers. What is your view about police officers being in Champaign-Urbana schools? You know, should they be there? Is it harmful? Is it helpful? I'll start with, I haven't heard from Professor Paik but for a while. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, police should absolutely not be in schools. So, I mean, I feel like this is a kind of softball easy question. This is low-hanging fruit. I understand that some people have bought into the narrative that we need police in schools because of events like Columbine, which is really when you see the kind of call for having cops in schools be taken seriously. But if you actually look at the data, cops do not make schools safer from, you know, those kinds of horrific shootings. They do not make the school safer in general. What they do, again, is to socially control an unequal social order that also exists in schools. Schools are not separate from the rest of society, right? It's not like you enter the doors and then like everything is equal and great and everything's egalitarian, right? Our whole like the history of civil rights is largely about education as being not spaces of equality. So when you have cops go in there, what do you expect will happen? The same kind of inequitable distribution of violence and control that you see elsewhere, right? And so cops definitely should not be in schools. The other thing that I want to point out with the presence of police in schools is, why are we spending money on an ineffective solution to dealing with school, discipline and interpersonal conflict among kids, right? We have schools that don't have nurses there 7 days a week, right? We don't have mental health counselors or school counselors in our schools 7 days a week. And yet we have cops in there 7 days a week. How is that a reflection of our values when we're dealing with our young people who are going to be our future leaders? We are basically telling them we are more invested. Literally, we are more invested in terms of what we resource. We are more invested in controlling them than in caring for them. And I think this is the fundamental problem and the issue that we're trying to get across, that we want our resources to be allocated in a way that reflects our actual values. Right? I don't think either of the mayors I don't think that reflects what they think of our children, right? But if that is the case, then we need to reallocate our actual resources to reflect our actual values. But yeah, we need cops off campus. Thanks.
Professor Reynolds, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Naomi. I don't think that police have any role in schools at all, and they are indeed siphoning resources from these really important aspects of schooling and teachers' needs. We don't have enough nurses, social workers, teachers' aides, specialists in autism. If you've gone to school board meetings, you've heard, teachers and PTA members talk about the needs that they have that can be very easily resolved by having more resources, more monetary resources that are instead going to police officers. What is it, 300,000 in Urbana paying for cops in schools? And it's really, they are functioning in schools in the same way that they are in society. They're not educators. They're not trained to be educational administrators. They're trained to be police, and that's what they're doing when they're in school. They're also policing Black and brown bodies. They're intimidating children. But then there's this mythology around policing that takes effect in schools, where we have police coming in every year, visiting kindergarten classrooms, visiting first and second grade classrooms, with all this propaganda about how they're there to serve and protect them, and that they're a safety mechanism for these students, when indeed we should actually be protecting our students from those police officers, because they're more likely to be harmed by the police officers than they are any active shooter or any natural disaster, in which we have all these drills and resources also going to those areas.
Chief Cobb, any response to that? And how many officers in the Champaign departments are in schools in Champaign?
Mr. Hardwick, there are 5 school resource officers in the city of Champaign, 3 at the middle school, 2 at the high schools. I just leave it at that.
Okay. Sheriff Heuerman, I mean, is there any benefit to having officers? And I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are no deputies that are in schools. Am I correct, or is that?
No, Reginald. I actually have 2 deputies that are in schools. One in the Tolono School District, and then one also in St. Joe in Prairie View. And my experience is different than what I've been hearing tonight. And I don't know if it's just because it's the county setting or what, but the superintendents and the parents and the students all seem to love my school resource officers. So I'm not sure. And I only have school resource officers in the schools 5 days a week, not 7. So I actually never knew that there were school resource officers 7 days a week in schools. But they go in, they teach, DARE type classes. They go in, they form mentoring relationships. Feedback I've gotten from my school resource officers is that it's a good mentoring opportunity. But I'm not going to start, I'm not going to say that it's the same exact experience as what it might be in the schools in Champaign and Urbana, because I just don't know if it is or not.
Let me ask you, Chief Cobb, and I know you had a shorter answer before, but is there any positive from your point of view of having, especially in our local cities? I mean, you grew up in this community. What are the positives of having officers in their schools?
I think the positives have been demonstrated. The data has shown it. Unifor has a ton of data from surveys and conversation we've had with students, staff, as well as parents about the success of the school resource officer program. We've had a program in existence since 2006, and the number of students arrested has continually to decline. A lot of people talk about the school to prison pipeline, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying it doesn't exist in our community. I agreed to become part of this committee to have a conversation about Champaign-Urbana policing, but I think we're talking more global. We're talking more across the country. We're talking a lot of things that's a lot broader, and so that's the reason why I'm a little bit more quiet. But I'll be honest with you, I'm proud of our program. I'm proud of our officers. I'm proud of the work that they do there. I do think we can make some impactful changes, and I do think there's a lot of great input been offered by this group of panelists, and some things they're suggesting we should be looking at and should be ready to touch upon, and possibly even take it to the next level and do some things around what changes can we make to make things different. I do think we have more in common than we have not in common, but I think we're spending more time talking about what we don't have in common opposed to what we do have in common, and that's my frustration with the panel.
Mm-hmm. I want to quickly ask the mayors, because what do residents who talk to you all about? And I'm bringing up the schools and the police and schools because we've gotten a lot, even before Facebook went up this afternoon. We've had some questions about that. I'm just curious, what do residents tell you, Mayor Feinen or Mayor Marlin, about their views about officers being in schools?
So I think, it's important to recognize that that decision is made by the Champaign School District and not by the Champaign City Council. And so what I hear from residents is often from fellow parents, because I have children in the district. And I do hear some as mayor as well, but I think most of our residents are sophisticated enough that they know that the decision-making on this issue happens at the school board, and they're doing a lot of engaging with the school board right now on that topic. I think, because I've watched some school board meetings, that past surveys have shown that people were happy with and liked having the student resource officers in the schools. I think the district has recognized that that they need to have another survey, that survey is a few years old, and that they need to get new data and they need to give residents an opportunity to be heard. And so I believe that that is something that they are currently working on.
In Urbana, until very recently, there was a half-time officer assigned to the high school, and it was paid for by the city. So it wasn't until just very recently that the city of Urbana signed a contract with the Urbana School District, and there currently will be one full-time resource officer in the high school and the middle school. There was a very animated just discussions at the school board meetings for several months related to the school resource officer issue. I heard from a lot of parents and a lot of people, and there was strong support for school resource officers. There were some strong voices against them, but in the end, the school board voted to add the 2 resource officers. I personally have sat down with one of our resource officers, Michelle Robinson, and have had actually a fair number of conversations with her. And her role in the school is not one of discipline. That is up to the administrator, to the staff at the school. Her role is a support there. She's developed relationships with students. She's a mother herself. She's in a mentoring role. And she's been helping, just on a personal basis. During the pandemic, especially, she's been having personal contact with some of the students. So I do support the resource officers in the school, but bottom line, this is a decision that will be made by the school district, and the city will support what they decide. But so far, it's worked out. It's worked out okay.
Okay. We're entering our last half hour. We're a little actually over, but I wanted to, as we head into, starting to wrap up, I know that Chief Cobb and Mayor Feinen, you announced earlier this week that there are rising incidents of gun violence in Champaign. Last year was a record year of 100 incidents. We've had 95 incidents as of Monday. And we still got 5 months to go. How do you deal with issues such as gun violence, but still ensure safe interactions between the Black community and law enforcement? Obviously, we're not talking about the people who are committing the violence, but obviously it's a situation and a problem that you're looking to the community to help you tackle. How do you do that?
Well, we strive to build relationships, continue to build relationships with our community. The last thing we want to do is to go into our community and put our communities under siege at any point in time because we're trying to rid out bad behavior. We want to partner with our citizens to identify who are committing these crimes and to hold them accountable. So that's a lot of our effort. Part of the reason why we did the press conference was to update the community where we're at, to redouble our efforts and our commitment to working with our citizens, to encourage our citizens to continue to partner with us. We do recognize there's a very, very small percentage of people involved in gun violence, but unfortunately, these are crimes of opportunity that's happening in multiple areas across our city, and there's no place that's immune from it. And so that's the reason why we have to decide as a community that we're not going to tolerate this in any part of our city, and we're going to work together to try to rid these problems from occurring. There's a multifaceted approach. It's not just law enforcement driven, it's a coalition approach. We're asking our social services, our faith-based, and our citizens all to come together and work with us as we try to help these individuals who are involved in these disagreements to find other ways to settle their disagreements opposed to using a gun.
I want to ask our mayors, and we just got a question that I think is really timely. We're hearing about the federal agents that the federal government is sending into Chicago, into Kansas City, and Albuquerque. Is there any, have you had any, I will ask this for the mayors, and I know Mayor Feinen, because again, you had a press conference earlier this week. Is there any indication that we would see federal agents here?
Yeah, I have no indication that we would see federal agents here. I am not sure that the White House would announce that prior to it occurring, but that is not something that we would support here in our community. The concern of having, unmarked federal agents that are physically and verbally abusive to our community members, that is concerning. I also think that it's probably unlikely to happen here. We are not maybe a large enough city that they seem to be moving toward the bigger cities. There's a threat about Chicago. And I don't know if Chief has heard anything. I don't know if they would alert us prior to coming, but it's certainly not, we have not requested them come, and we do not want them to be here.
I have a question about resources, and someone was asking in Urbana, and I know we don't have a representative. We did ask the police chief, and I think he's on vacation, but in Urbana, what is the situation with violence? Is that on the rise in Urbana, and how has the budget help with that? Can that help reduce it? You know, do you need to reduce in police and put it towards reducing gun violence? I mean, how does that, first of all, is it on the rise in Urbana?
Gun violence is on the rise somewhat in Urbana, and what's particularly concerning over the past couple of years has been the increase in gun violence among kids, teenagers, the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds. I mean, in April, we had, you know, tragically, a 15-year-old was murdered by a 16-year-old as he was riding his bike. And we've had a number of incidents with involving teens with guns, and that's what's very much concerning to me. This is a gun violence, and the incredibly apparently easy access to guns throughout this community is an area where, you know, we as cities can't do it alone. We need common sense national courage to do gun regulation, and you know, we can do as much as we possibly can at the local level, but without federal leadership, and even federal leadership on this issue, it's going to be very difficult for communities. And you know, the use of guns is tied to many other factors. As you know, there's an intersection among everything. You know, it's not just a gun thing, but the prevalence and easy access to guns just drives me nuts. I mean, it just drives me nuts. And that's where we need leadership at the federal level. And it's failed to happen to date.
And you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but someone has told us, but the policing budget has increased in Urbana. Am I correct, over the past years?
No, I mean, that was there was an increase last year because we had restored, we'd gotten back on, we had fallen behind on pension funding. And much of the increase that was seen last year was we have gotten back on track to catch up on where we need to be on pension funding. But our budget this year for police was about $11 million. It's about 21% of our overall expenditures in Urbana. Okay. There was also a slight increase because we did add the 2 school resource officers, and we're paying for we're fronting the costs for the automobiles and some other equipment for them, and the school district's picking up the rest of the tab.
And I have a question from a viewer, but I saw Professor Paik raise her hand. What did you?
So I was looking through the Urbana budget since 1998 to the present. And in 1998-99, the Urbana budget for police was less than $4 million. In 2018-2019, it was $9.5 million. And for 2021, the coming fiscal year, it's just over $11 million. So it's just objectively not true that the police budget has not grown in Urbana. So that I'm just a little confused about that. And then also, you know, it's more than doubled in the last 10 years, and yet gun violence is on the rise. So it just seems that this is an investment in a solution that is not effective and that is not working, and that maybe we should try something else that might be more effective, more cost effective, and better for our citizens as a whole. And I think, you know, it's not like we're not without models. Like, we have models of violence interrupters in places where gun violence is a very serious issue, like in places like Baltimore and in Chicago. And I think we can look to examples like this to rethink how we approach this problem that, as Chief Cobb mentioned, that we all see as something that we don't want in our communities, right? I think this is a shared thing that we do want to de-escalate, but it just seems that our, you know, doubling the police budget has not been a good solution. I mean, you have the stats, right? You have rising police budgets, you have rises in gun crime. You know,
but budgets are going to increase over 22 years from 1998 to 2020. Salaries increase, numbers of officers increase, and police, the department is taking on different responsibilities as well. So I don't think it's valid to compare a budget from 1998 to 2020.
Last 10 years, and it's more than doubled in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I think, you know, the key phrase that came out in your response was that you've hired more officers and that you have officers expanding their roles in the work that they do. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're trying to shift the conversation, that we're investing in non-solutions that don't work. And so why don't we try something else that might be more cost effective to all of our taxpayers and that might actually decrease violence?
I am all for reallocating funding, and it's been brought up several times during this discussion, is to think about what do we need police to do and what are they doing that we have really kind of defaulted to the police to end up taking care of because of the society has failed to address. So we're looking at homelessness, we're looking at, like I mentioned, mental health issues, we're looking at income inequities and poverty, and you know, we have a lot of things that we as a society have failed to really fundamentally address, and the police deal with the consequences. And they'll be the first to say that they would love to have some of this burden shifted from them, but they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So that's the conversation I think it's very important to have. And you know, this has been a very good conversation tonight.
Yeah, I'm
Jason,
really
I'm sorry. I'm gonna get to Evelyn because she did raise her hand, but Jason Gonzalez asked, what evidence of positive outcomes like reductions in gun violence have come from ample investment in policing? Is there any, and I know that's maybe putting people on the spot, but is there any examples that we can think of
I think from my point of view, Naomi just kind of spoke to that there is no correlation between the increase in police budgets and the expansion of police departments and a reduction in crime. Those two aren't correlated. And so these resources that are going toward policing aren't actually resolving any issues of gun violence or anything else. And I think that there's a lot of double speaking and things happening here. Because what I've seen since I've lived here in the last 10 years is a continuous divestment from our mental health services, from homeless shelters, the closing of detox centers. But at the same time, we're saying, oh, we need to invest in our community. Oh, our community has so many issues. Well, police departments and law enforcement needs to relinquish those funds that they keep generating more and more every year and into those social services and into professionals that are trained to deal with conflict resolution and mental health issues, social workers. That's where that investment needs to go. Police are not the ones to even lead that charge. And I don't understand how police are also the ones leading the charge on anti-gun violence when there's more guns within police departments than anywhere else. And so I don't understand how the very purveyors of a lot of violence and the folks that have the most guns are also the same ones that are preaching this anti-gun tactics. And so it all seems very contradictory to me in the conversation.
Let me ask you, Sheriff Heuerman, I mean, do we ask too much of law enforcement? I'm just plain, you know, again, you're expected to be answering the mental health call. You're expected to, you know, react to accidents. You're expected to, you know, be in so many different places. I mean, are we just asking too much? And is there, in the law enforcement community, and I know you can't speak for everybody, you know, saying, yes, you know, push, you know, divert some of this activity or resources to other places and so that those people can deal with things. And, you know, what are you hearing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Reginald. I think that, so there's no doubt there's a systemic issue, right? And so just to be brief about it, I would like to think that hiring unbiased officers, regardless of what some people think, is my way of trying to help mitigate that system that is way out of my control, right? You got judges, you got legislature, you got a whole bunch of things. I'm trying to do what I can as a sheriff to get my little piece and make it a little bit better. That's why I ran for sheriff. I do think that police are overwhelmed. I do think we're doing a lot of duties that we were never meant to do in the first place. But what I think the bigger question is how do we get back to funding appropriately? Because I don't believe that we can just take money from the police and put it into other resources, because we've still got the shots fired calls. We've still got all of these things going on that never should be happening in the first place. We should be investing in kids. We should be making sure that they know how to reasonably resolve their conflicts and things. They don't. And so taking money away from the police without simply gradually doing it. I think taking money away from the police will then just put less officers on the street to be able to respond to that violent crime, wherein we need to gradually transition. We need to put a lot more money into programs and gradually transition that role out of the police, which will then eventually say we need less police officers on the streets.
Chief Cobb, I ask you the same thing. Are we just asking law enforcement too much? And would it help to have more mental health, but less officers, or if you have officers who specialize in mental health or diverted to those other areas? I mean, first of all, let me ask you, are we asking too much of law enforcement?
Yes.
Okay. Can you elaborate? What about diverting resources? What is that an answer?
We're asking a lot of law enforcement. I think there's other professions and other entities that can be better qualified, better suited to deal with some of those issues. There are even some law enforcement type calls or issue. We might find better ways to investigate or deal with those, not necessarily using a police officer who's completely sworn or someone who's carrying a gun. There's community service officers. There's other things that we can approach and look at ways, maybe using a citizen's force to address some of the lower hanging fruit. When we're talking about calls where there's no suspect on scene, no suspect information, or someone's coming out the process, do we necessarily need a sworn officer to do all that? I think we can be as creative as we want. There's communities who've done some of this if we choose to deal with that. But I do think there is some need for police. There are times when there's proactive crimes in progress where if there's a domestic, one's getting beat up, whether it's male or female, and they need immediate assistance. Someone breaking in your home and you're terrified, you need immediate assistance. And I'm in a car accident and I'm pinned and other cars are coming on top of me. We need immediate assistance. You're going to need police officers and first responders to deal with those type of things that are in progress that are happening and addressing that. But I do think there's other things that we can find out. But with mental health stuff, we can push to mental health providers. There's some of these low-hanging inner conflicts that we might have social workers or others that may be better suited to deal with it. But unfortunately, law enforcement gets sent to deal with everything. We become the ultimate first responder to address society's problems or issues. There's a lot of similarities, in my opinion, between what law enforcement and teachers have to deal with. But I'll stop there.
Tatiana, I know it's been a while since I called on you. I mean, what are you hearing when you talk to people about resources and where they need to go, or what are people saying to you?
I will first start off by saying that I do agree with Chief Cobb that in reality we do still need police officers. So I don't think that this conversation is about like getting rid of police completely. That's just not a reality. But saying that, okay, we need these programs, but let's gradually take the money, or maybe we don't. We cannot decide to tax people. So people are worried, like, are they going to just tax us more to cover these programs when we already have the money on the books? We have it within the police department. If we're saying and agreeing that it's too much work on the police officers, then we should equally agree that let's take the fund from that they may use to send two officers out on a call that does not require them and have a psychologist there or a neighborhood committee. We have so many organizations within Champaign and Urbana that are currently functioning to try to have violence prevention, in de-escalation tactics. But we're not connecting the dots. We're not actually having that real dialogue and have an agreement on the book saying that, okay, this is how much it's going to cost us. We need to take it from here. It seems to always circle back to, we kind of, within the community, we're noticing that being a trend. We don't want that to continue to be a trend. We want to see real action take place. And it is an option for it to take place. As Professor Paik said, we see the budget rising, right? It's at $11 million. Where exactly is that money going? Is that new cars? Is that weaponry? What is it going to? The community doesn't understand why it needs to cost that much, yet we're saying this is too much work for the police and let's have these other committees. How do you think that these programs are going to be funded without the funds?
Tariq, you suggested, and this is specific to the University of Illinois and their public safety unit be changed. I mean, what would be the benefits of that?
I think you're referring to Dr. Paik's,
Oh, okay.
something Dr. Paik wrote on that.
Okay, I'm sorry. I may have, but I would
But I do agree with that.
Okay, well, tell us what would be the benefit? You know, why do you agree with it? I guess.
Well, you know, as we're looking at like you know, policing either on the university or whether it's in schools or wherever, again, this all goes back to what is the function of the police, and we see that function play out. So if it's on the university, we're going to see that it's Black and brown students who are going to be disproportionately targeted by the police. We've seen that in the SROs. I don't know what the current number is, but you know, back when there was CUCPJ, they had put out some statistics that said 80% of the SRO's punitive contacts with students were with Black students. Even though, and Black students don't make 80% of the population in the high schools, and yet they were the most targeted. And we see that on the university. We've seen high numbers of like no trespass citations and things like that, mostly against Black people. And so for me, it has to do with, it's not just about defunding the police. It is about disempowering the police. They have too much power. Their function in society is not a function. Their function that Dr. Paik brought up about upholding a system of inequality, that is not a function that we need. And so as long as that's the function of the police, then even the good cops just doing their job are going to do things that uphold that function. And so as long as that's the function of the police, then we need to be disempowering the police and getting them out of our schools, getting them off of our campuses. I see them as having a predatory role.
Well, let me follow up though. Okay, you disempower and defunded police, but as we mentioned at the very beginning, this is a systemic, institutional, and you have people that, you know, have used police to do their bidding for controlling communities, or they have defunded mental health. They have defunded all these things. So you have one element that you've removed out. How are you getting to the other things that need to be, and how are you changing the minds of people who are powerful and may not want certain populations to live in their communities or do not want interaction? I mean, you've gotten rid of the police, you know, how do you affect all those other institutional things?
I think Dr. Paik, I have a million things I could say on that, but I think Dr.
Okay.
Paik has her hand up.
Go ahead, Professor.
I want to refer back to some of the opening comments that the mayors and the sheriff made about, you know, that it wasn't until they moved to Champaign and started actually interacting with people who were from a more heterogeneous, diverse community that they started learning about these issues. Or it wasn't until not even college, but law school that you're learning about these structural issues and learning about US history, right? And so I think if you look at what we're talking about in the call to divest from the University Police Department, it's not just about divesting from the University Police Department. It is also about, again, taking those resources and reallocating them to the very education that we need in order to not only just disempower or defund the police, but to also educate people about about US history, about the function of police, right? And so our first call for investment is about building curriculum and also funding it around diversity issues, around racial histories, around the role of the police, et cetera. I think we also see that, you know, we did all this research and everything. And also, let me just say, I did not write this letter. Students worked with faculty to write this letter, right? But we looked at the research and, you know, the Mental Health Counseling Center gets $20,000 a year in its budget. The police department gets more than $8 million a year in its budget. And let me tell you something, I have students every single semester who need to go to counseling services. And they tell me that they're trying to get an appointment, but it is very difficult to get the consistent care that they need because the mental health counseling center is so under-resourced, right? And so it's not just about defunding, dismantling, it's about doing these same things all at the same time. You're right, we have to address the structural issues, which has to do with like educating all of us. All of us have a role to play in this. This is not just about attacking the police. That is not the point, right? But it's about what are we giving resources to actually address the root issues of all the problems that get expressed in police misconduct and violence in its most, visible signs when someone dies, right? But we have to do all of this all at the same time, right? And this is not impossible. This is absolutely possible, and it's realizable.
Okay, well, we have had a quite spirited discussion, and we're a little over on our time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I appreciate you taking time on a summer evening to talk with us. We do have one last question that for our panelists, but I first want to thank all of them for joining us and all of you for joining us online. And these are extremely important discussions. It's important to us here at WILL and Illinois Public Media, and we live right here in Champaign-Urbana, and I have a few people I want to thank. Kimberly Kranick, our Director of Community and Content and Engagement here at IPM. DJ Roach, who's the director, making sure all of our graphics and our cameras and all the people you hear on our panel are coming up. Alex Coleman, our digital producer. Gabriela Castellanos, our engagement intern, who helped me write some of these questions. And Liz Westfield, who helped promote this. And we know we had a large audience at times, and we really appreciate it, and we know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but I want to go in closing. I want to ask all 8 of our panelists, in closing, just like the title of our program, what should be the role of police in Champaign-Urbana? And this time we will go alphabetically, and we'll start with Titianna Ammons.
I think our role for the police should be a role of service. They're community members and essentially leaders, every one of them, when they respond to major calls. So while I do think that some defunding and reworking of the police needs to happen, I definitely think they should work in a service role when they're out in the community.
Chief Cobb?
I would agree with Ms. Ammons. I do think the role of police officers were public servants, and we should be serving our citizens, providing professional service to them. But the operative word is always going to be service.
Mayor Feinen?
I would say service along with safety, and they should be helpers. They're people, they need to be people that are trusted within the community, that everyone feels that they can call for the service that they need.
Sheriff Heuerman?
So I think policing in our community, or police officers in our community, their number one role is to help communities stay safe. If something happens at 3 o'clock in the morning and somebody breaks into my house, I would want a police officer to come and take care of the situation. I think that maybe bigger is partnerships with groups to help increase the prevention. So let's stop crime from happening in the first place. Let's work with our communities. As Titianna said, we all live here. And so, I am affected just like anybody else in our community is with us gun crime and those types of things. Work with individuals and businesses to help protect themselves. And then also just make sure, we have that public service oriented philosophy and not that authoritarian type of philosophy.
Tariq Khan?
Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise. I don't see much role for the police in sort of my ideal society. But, if they really do believe in this sort of, humanitarian and not authoritarian mission, then let's see the charges against Aaliyah Lewis dropped. Let's see the felony charges against the people from the marketplace protest dropped. And let's see if they actually believe that they don't want to be this authoritarian repressive force, because right now that is not the case. Drop the charges against Aaliyah Lewis, for goodness sakes.
Mayor Marlin?
The role of police is service based in respect, and there is a role for the police to help us figure out where we're going in the future, because we can take we should draw on their experience and perspective as we move forward. And I believe the vast majority of the police officers in Champaign-Urbana anyway joined this profession because they did want to help people and they did want to serve the community. And I do believe they're doing that well today.
Professor Paik.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for bringing us together for this important conversation. And I also really appreciate hearing Chief Cobb, the sheriff, and both of our mayors affirm the argument several times over the course of this discussion that the role of the police should be reduced and redirected to other kinds of resources, like around housing, around mental health services, et cetera. And I really look forward to seeing how that actually plays out in real policy. To answer your question, I completely believe Chief Cobb and Sheriff and that they and many of their officers really want to serve. What I would like to see is those individual officers and leaders of police serve the community wearing different uniforms in different jobs that are not armed with a gun or a taser or any other kind of weapon and are not authorized to use force. So it's basically, I would love for you to serve in a completely redefined capacity.
And Professor Reynolds, last word.
Yeah, I would love for the police to do what they've never done before, which would be to step aside and relinquish the power that they have and the resources that they have and do what we've talked about in this conversation, redirect those resources into communities, build up secure individuals and secure families and secure communities through housing, education, accessible and affordable healthcare. That's what I would like to see, because I don't think that we give citizens and non-police folks enough credit. And I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for our ability to resolve conflict on our own, a variety of different types of conflict. We engage with this every day in families, among friend circles. A fight might break out or other more extreme things happen that we resolve ourselves. We don't always call the police for those things. So we're much more capable of dealing with these things than we've given ourselves credit for. And so I'd love for the police to step aside and relinquish those resources, relinquish that power, and let the community lead this movement.
Thank you again to all of our panelists for talking with us tonight. And this video will be on the Illinois Newsroom Facebook page, as well as on will.illinois.edu later this evening. From WILL's Illinois Newsroom, I'm Reginald Hardwick, News and Public Affairs Director, and thank you so much for your time. And for all of us at Illinois Public Media, stay safe and good night.